The girl in the phone booth. The morning was brisk, the chill of early autumn still hanging in the London air as PC Daniel Carter made his way through the quiet streets of Westminster. The city was waking up, shopkeepers rolling up metal shutters, early commuters clutching steaming cups of coffee, and a few joggers pacing through St. James's Park. Daniel had walked this beat for years, knew every alley and corner, every shortcut that led from the heart of the city to the quieter residential areas. He liked the quiet of the morning before the city erupted into its usual chaos. That was when he saw her, a young girl, no older than 7 or 8, darting through the streets in a bright blue dress. Her small legs moved with desperate urgency, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Something about the way she ran sent alarm bells ringing in his head. This wasn't the playful sprint of a child late for school. This was fear. Daniel picked up his pace. Hey, you there." His voice cut through the early morning air, but she didn't slow down. She looked over her shoulder, and in that split second, Daniel saw the panic in her wide brown eyes. Then she disappeared down an alley. Daniel cursed under his breath, breaking into a run. The city was waking up around him, people stepping onto the pavement, traffic building. He weaved through pedestrians, apologizing as he pushed past them. He reached the corner where she had disappeared and stopped, scanning the surroundings. Silence. Then a faint sobbing. He turned, following the sound. At the edge of the alley stood an old, nearly forgotten red phone booth, its paint peeling, the glass smeared with dirt. Through the grimy window, he saw her tiny form curled up inside, clutching the receiver with trembling fingers. Heart pounding, Daniel approached the booth, his breath fogging up the glass. He pulled the door open slowly. The girl gasped and shrank into the corner, gripping the phone like a lifeline. Daniel held up his hands, showing he meant no harm. "It's okay. I'm a police officer. My name's Daniel. Are you all right?" She didn't respond. Instead, she clutched the receiver even tighter, her knuckles turning white. That's when he heard it. A deep male voice on the other end of the line. Gruff, low, demanding. Daniel's blood ran cold. "Who are you talking to?" he asked gently. The girl's lips trembled. She hesitated, then whispered, "The bad man." The word sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Before he could ask anything else, the voice on the other end shouted something, and the girl's face twisted in fear. She slammed the receiver down. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Something was very, very wrong. He immediately reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is PC Carter. I need immediate backup at my location. Possible child in danger." The girl flinched at his words. Then, before Daniel could stop her, she bolted from the booth and ran. And this time, she wasn't running toward safety. She was running straight back into danger. Into the shadows. PC Daniel Carter's pulse hammered in his ears as he sprinted after the girl. The early morning streets of London were stirring with activity, but in his mind, the only thing that existed was the small figure in the blue dress darting away from him. She was fast, far faster than he expected for her tiny legs. She twisted through the alleys like she knew them well, dodging bins, slipping between pedestrians who barely noticed the chase unfolding in their midst. Daniel didn't shout this time. He didn't want to scare her further, but every fiber of his being told him not to let her out of his sight. She bolted across the road, just as a black cab screeched to a halt, honking angrily. Daniel barely stopped himself from crashing into the car's side mirror. "Oi, watch where you're going," the driver yelled. Daniel ignored him and kept running. By the time he reached the opposite pavement, she was already disappearing into a side street. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He picked up speed. His boots slammed against the concrete as he pushed through the growing crowd. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Then, just as he rounded the corner, he stopped dead. The street was empty. No girl. No movement. Gone. Daniel turned in a slow circle, his sharp gaze scanning every doorway, every alleyway. No way. She couldn't have just disappeared. His breathing was heavy, mist forming in the cool morning air as he tried to steady himself. He turned to his radio. "Dispatch, this is PC Carter." The child ran, lost visual, at Wilton Crescent. "I need support canvassing the area." He waited for a response, but before he could get one, something caught his eye. A shadow shifting near a set of old stone steps, leading down into what looked like a basement entryway. Daniel moved quickly, his instincts on high alert. The steps led to a narrow, rusted metal door, slightly ajar. His hand went to his radio again. "Dispatch, I may have found something. I'm going in." With a slow, controlled breath, he pushed the door open. The air inside was damp, musty with a faint metallic scent that sent his senses on edge. The space beyond was dimly lit by the pale glow of a single flickering light bulb. And there she was, curled up in the corner, trembling, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. "Hey," Daniel said softly, stepping forward with caution. She flinched, pulling her knees to her chest. His heart squeezed at the sight. She was terrified, not of him, but of whatever she was running from. "It's okay," he reassured, keeping his voice steady. "You're safe now." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she whispered, "No, I'm not." Daniel's breath hitched. "Who were you talking to on the phone?" he asked gently. She shook her head violently. I can't tell you." "Is it your father?" Daniel guessed. She flinched hard. It was the only confirmation he needed. Daniel crouched down, making sure to keep some distance so he didn't seem threatening. "Listen to me. I know you're scared, but I need to help you. You called someone for help. Was it your mom?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was a good sign. She trusted her mother. "Where is she now?" he asked. The girl's lip trembled. "Home." Daniel's stomach tightened. Is she in danger? A single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't have to answer. He already knew. The name she wouldn't say. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city waking up outside. Daniel's mind was racing. He needed to know who this child was, where she lived, and most importantly, who she was running from. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl looked away. He tried again. "I promise, I'm only asking so I can help. If you don't want to tell me your last name, that's okay. Just your first." She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, so softly it was almost a breath, she said, "Amelia." Daniel smiled reassuringly. "That's a beautiful name, Amelia." A flicker of emotion passed through her eyes, but she quickly looked away. He hesitated before asking his next question. "And the man you were talking to, the bad man, was that your stepfather?" Amelia froze. Her fingers clenched into the fabric of her dress. She was shaking now, but it wasn't from the cold. Daniel's jaw tightened. There it was. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the anger simmering in his chest. Amelia's chin wobbled. She nodded once. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, forcing down the fury rising in him. He had been an officer for a long time, had seen the worst sides of humanity, but nothing got under his skin like a child being harmed in their own home. "Your mom," he started carefully. "Did he hurt her too?" Amelia sucked in a sharp breath. Then, for the first time, she looked Daniel in the eyes. And that's when he saw it. Not just fear, desperation, like she had been waiting her entire life for someone to ask her that question. Then, in a whisper so soft, he barely caught it, she said, "He's going to kill her." The storm that followed. Daniel shot to his feet, already reaching for his radio. "This is PC Carter. I have a confirmed case of domestic abuse. Possible life-threatening situation. I need immediate backup at. He stopped. He didn't know Amelia's address. He turned back to her. Amelia, where do you live? I need to know now. Her hands curled into fists, hesitation warring with urgency on her dumb face. Then, finally, she gave the answer that changed everything. Pimlico. Near the old church. Daniel swore under his breath. That was a quiet residential district, not far from here. Too close. If her stepfather had figured out that Amelia ran, her mother could already be in danger. Daniel wasted no time. He scooped Amelia up into his arms, ignoring her gasp of surprise. "We're getting your mom out of there," he told her firmly. He rushed outside, radioing the station as he went. "This is PC Carter. I'm heading to a possible hostage situation. Suspect: Gareth Wilkins. Victims: Amelia and Linda Mena Wilkins. Backup needed immediately." As he reached his patrol car, Amelia grabbed his sleeve. Her face was pale. "If he sees you, he'll try to stop you." Daniel met her eyes. A grim determination settled in his chest. "Let him try." He placed her gently in the passenger seat, started the engine, and flipped on the sirens. They sped through the London streets toward Pimlico. He only prayed they wouldn't be too late. The House of Secrets. The sirens wailed through the early morning streets of London as PC Daniel Carter drove through the winding roads towards Pimlico. His grip on the wheel was tight, his eyes flicking between the road and Amelia, who sat in the passenger seat, hugging herself. Her breathing was shallow. Her small fingers curled into the fabric of her blue dress, twisting it nervously. Every few seconds, her wide eyes darted toward the window as if expecting something or someone to be chasing them. Daniel knew fear when he saw it, and Amelia wasn't just afraid. She was terrified. "Amelia, listen to me." He kept his voice calm, measured, even as his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. "When we get there, I need you to stay in the car. No matter what. Do you understand?" She hesitated, then nodded, her small fingers gripping the seatbelt. Daniel didn't like leaving her alone, but he had no choice. If Gareth Wilkins was as dangerous as Amelia feared, he couldn't risk her getting caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. He pressed his radio. "Dispatch, this is PC Carter. ETA 2 minutes to the Wilkins residence in Pimlico. Suspect is Gareth Wilkins. Possible domestic violence situation. Potential hostage. Need backup on site ASAP." "Copy that, PC Carter. Units en route. ETA 6 minutes. Too long." Daniel swore under his breath. A lot could happen in 6 minutes. He turned onto a quiet street lined with pristine white townhouses, the kind that spoke of old wealth and respectability. Flower pots sat on windowsills, and neatly trimmed hedges lined the pavement. The kind of place where nobody wanted to believe monsters lived. But they did. And he was about to meet one. Amelia suddenly gripped his sleeve. "That one." She pointed toward a modest but well-kept townhouse. The curtains drawn. A single porch light flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the doorstep. Daniel pulled the car to a stop and turned to Amelia. "Remember, stay here. Lock the doors. If anything happens, you don't move until I come back for you." Amelia swallowed hard, but she nodded. Daniel stepped out, his boots crunching on the pavement. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. His instincts screamed at him. Something was very wrong. He moved up the steps quickly, his hand hovering near his holster, just in case. He pressed the doorbell. Silence. He knocked. Firm, loud. "Police, open up." No answer. He knocked again, harder. "This is PC Carter. I need to speak with Linda Mena Wilkins." Still nothing. Daniel's pulse spiked. He turned, scanning the windows. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement. Upstairs. A shadow, barely visible through the curtains. Someone was inside. Daniel took a step back, his gut screaming at him that time was running out. He tried the doorknob. Locked. No choice. He radioed in. "Dispatch, I'm forcing entry. Possible victim inside. I can't wait for backup." Then, with a sharp inhale, he stepped back and kicked the door in. The silent house. The door slammed open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stale, thick with something Daniel couldn't quite place. He stepped in cautiously, hand on his weapon, his sharp eyes scanning everything. The house was silent. Too silent. Something about that silence set his nerves on edge. No TV, no movement, no voices, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then a noise, a soft whimper. Upstairs, Daniel's heart slammed into his ribs. He moved fast, his boots barely making a sound on the carpeted stairs. He reached the landing, his ears straining. Then he heard it. A voice. A man's voice. Low. Cold. "I told you what would happen if you embarrassed me." Daniel's breath hitched. Gareth. He moved toward the sound, his steps careful, controlled. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and froze, the monster in the room. Linda Mina Wilkins was on the floor, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutching her ribs as if they were broken. Standing over her was Gareth, a man in his early 40s, his blonde hair neatly combed, his crisp white shirt slightly unbuttoned, like this was just another normal morning. But in his hand, he held a belt, and Daniel could see the red welts on Linda's arms, the marks of a man who thought he owned the world around him. Gareth turned slowly, his blue eyes sharp and filled with something ugly. For a second, there was no fear, no guilt, just annoyance, like Daniel was an inconvenience. "Well," Gareth said, his voice smooth, "I was wondering how long it would take before someone came knocking." Daniel's jaw tightened. His entire body screamed at him to take this bastard down, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Step away from her. Now." Gareth's lips curled. "And if I don't?" Daniel's patience snapped. He closed the distance in 2 steps, grabbing Gareth by the wrist and twisting sharply. The belt clattered to the floor. "Ah, you son of a..." Gareth struggled, but Daniel was stronger. He twisted Gareth's arm behind his back, slamming him against the nearest wall. "You're under arrest for domestic assault. Don't move." Gareth laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, please. This is nothing. She deserved it." Daniel's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He wanted to hit him, wanted to wipe that smug look off his face. But he didn't. Instead, he focused on Linda. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Linda's lips trembled. She nodded, but her body shook with every breath. Daniel turned back to Gareth. He wanted this bastard gone. Now. He radioed in. "PC Carter. Suspect in custody. Tell backup to step it up. We need medical on site ASAP." He started to drag Gareth toward the door when... "Mommy." Daniel whipped around just in time to see Amelia running into the room, tears streaming down her face. Linda's eyes widened in horror. Gareth's face twisted into a sneer. "You little brat." Daniel barely had time to react before Gareth broke free from his grip and lunged straight for Amelia. The final blow. Daniel moved on instinct. He slammed into Gareth, shoving Amelia out of the way. They crashed into the bedside table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. Gareth snarled, swinging wildly. But Daniel was ready this time. One punch. Right to the jaw. Gareth hit the floor. Hard. The house erupted as backup finally arrived. Officers storming in, shouting commands. It was over. Daniel turned, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Amelia. She was shaking, her tiny hands clutching Linda's. Daniel crouched down, meeting her wide, tear-filled eyes. "It's okay. You're safe now." And for the first time since he met her, Amelia believed him. The aftermath of fear. The living room of the Wilkins residence was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of movement as officers secured the scene. The air was thick with tension, the kind that lingers in a place where violence had made a home for far too long. PC Daniel Carter stood in the middle of it, his heartbeat slowly returning to normal after the chaos upstairs. Behind him, Gareth Wilkins lay on the floor, handcuffed and groaning, his jaw already swelling from where Daniel had decked him. Two officers hoisted him to his feet. "You'll regret this, you know," Gareth sneered through gritted teeth, his voice raw with anger. "People like me don't stay locked up for long." Daniel didn't respond. He just clenched his fists, watching as Gareth was dragged out to the waiting police car, where a few curious neighbors had begun to gather. But Daniel wasn't thinking about Gareth anymore. He was thinking about the two people left inside the house, the ones who mattered most. Amelia's silence. Amelia hadn't spoken since it happened. She sat on the couch, small and curled up, clutching her mother's arm like she was afraid to let go. Linda was gently stroking her daughter's hair, murmuring soft words in their native tongue. Daniel crouched down beside them. "Linda, Amelia, you're safe now. He won't hurt you anymore." Linda managed a weak smile, but Amelia didn't look up. She just clung tighter, pressing her face against her mother's sleeve. Daniel felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest. He had seen this before. Survivors didn't always react the way people expected. They didn't cry, scream, or collapse in relief. Sometimes, they just went silent. He glanced at Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins, who had arrived just minutes after Gareth's arrest. She was standing near the door, her arms crossed, watching everything carefully. Sarah gave Daniel a small nod, stepping forward. "Linda, we need to take your official statement. But first, we can arrange for a safe place for you and Amelia. Would you be comfortable coming with us to the station?" Linda hesitated, her fingers curled protectively around her daughter. Daniel softened his voice. "Linda, I know it's overwhelming. But we have resources, people who can help you. You won't have to do this alone." A tear slipped down Linda's cheek. She wiped it away quickly. Then, finally, she nodded. "All right, but only if Amelia stays with me." Daniel nodded. "Of course." As they stood, preparing to leave, Linda glanced at the staircase, the place where so much had happened just minutes ago. Then she whispered something Daniel barely caught. "I should have left sooner." And those words, those 6 heartbreaking words, stayed with Daniel long after they left the house. The long road to safety. The drive to the police station was quiet. Daniel sat in the front seat, while Linda and Amelia were in the back. Every now and then, he glanced in the rearview mirror, checking on them. Linda sat upright, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression unreadable. Amelia leaned against the window, staring at the world passing by. She still hadn't said a word. Daniel could only imagine what was going on in her little head. For a child who had spent so long living in fear, what did freedom even feel like? Did it even feel real? The first night without fear. At the station, they were taken to a private room, away from the usual noise and chaos. Sarah took Linda's official statement while a social worker arrived to check on Amelia. Daniel watched as the woman knelt beside the child. "Hi, Amelia. My name is Claire. I help kids like you feel safe again." No response. Claire continued gently. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. That's okay. But I want you to know that nobody will hurt you here. You're safe." Amelia didn't react at first. Then, after a long pause, she did something that made Daniel's throat tighten. She reached out and took Claire's hand. It was small, a tiny gesture, but it meant everything. For the first time since they found her, Amelia was letting someone in. The confession that changed everything. After a few hours, Linda's statement was complete. She had told them everything. The verbal abuse, the isolation, The way Gareth controlled everything, even how she and Amelia ate, where they went, who they spoke to. And then, the physical violence. It had started small, a shove here, a grab there. Then came the slaps, the belt, the bruises she covered up. Daniel listened in silence, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Linda wiped at her tears. He told me no one would believe me. He said I was just another immigrant, that if I called the police, they'd take Amelia away from me. Daniel's chest tightened with fury. That was how men like Gareth worked. They didn't just hurt you. They made you believe you had no way out. Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. Linda, he lied to you. You did the right thing coming forward. And Amelia, she's safe now because of you. Linda nodded, her eyes glistening. Then, for the first time that night, Amelia spoke. Not because of her. The room went still. Linda turned sharply to her daughter. Amelia. The little girl frowned, staring at the table. It wasn't because of Mommy. It was because of me. Daniel's heart squeezed. I called 999. I ran away. I told the police. Then, finally, she looked up, her dark eyes filled with something new. Something Daniel hadn't seen in them before. Strength. I saved us. The future that awaited them. Later that night, after Linda and Amelia had been placed in emergency housing, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at his paperwork. He had done everything by the book. The case was solid. Gareth wouldn't be walking away from this one. But still, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of it all. He had seen a lot in his years as a cop. But Amelia, she was different. She had survived something no child should have to. And she had fought back on her own. As he packed up for the night, his phone buzzed. A text. From Sarah. She asked about you. Daniel stared at the screen. Amelia. He texted back. A moment later. Yeah, just wanted to know if you were okay. Daniel exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. He looked out the station window at the distant London skyline. For Amelia, life wouldn't be easy. But she had already proven one thing. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter. And for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't fighting alone. A new beginning in the darkest hour. The waiting game. Hours passed. The station buzzed with the usual rhythm of late-night reports, shifting officers, and tired paperwork. PC Daniel Carter sat in the quietest corner, his coffee gone cold, staring at his unfinished report. He hated this part. The part after the crisis, when the adrenaline faded, and all that remained was the reality of what had happened. The paperwork, the legal process, the slow grinding of the system. He had seen it too many times. People like Gareth Wilkins, they always tried to slither their way out. Money, influence, excuses. But this time, it was different. This time, he had Amelia. He glanced at the closed door of the victim interview room, where Linda and Amelia were still waiting for placement in emergency housing. They had refused to sleep, and Daniel couldn't blame them. How could you rest after surviving a war? The unspoken fear. He walked over and knocked gently. Linda's voice was soft, wary. Come in. Daniel pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the cold fluorescent light making the space feel smaller than it was. Amelia was still curled up next to her mother on the hard bench, but this time she wasn't shaking. She just stared. At the wall. At nothing. At a life she couldn't quite understand yet. Linda sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the dark rings under her eyes making her look older than she was. She had changed into a simple sweatshirt and jeans provided by the station, but even in fresh clothes, she still looked trapped. Daniel closed the door behind him and sat across from them. I wanted to check in on you both. How are you feeling? Linda let out a tired laugh, like I just survived a storm. Daniel nodded. Because you did. She sighed, rubbing her hands over her face. I should feel relieved. But I keep thinking, what if he finds us? What if he gets out? Daniel leaned forward, keeping his voice firm. Linda, he's not getting out. She gave him a weak, doubtful smile. You can't promise that. Daniel didn't look away. No, but I can promise you this. He won't lay another hand on either of you again. Not while I'm around. A flicker of emotion passed across her face. Gratitude, maybe. Or something deeper, something that came from finally being believed. The weight of the past. You're different from the others, Officer Carter, she said suddenly. Daniel frowned. How do you mean? Linda glanced at Amelia, then back at him. You listen. You care. I didn't think anyone like you would. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had heard it before, the distrust, the skepticism, and he understood. He had seen cases fall apart because the system protected the wrong people. He had seen survivors left in worse situations than when they started. So why was he different? Daniel leaned back. Because I know what it's like when no one listens. Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly. You? Daniel nodded, staring at the cold station table. He never talked about his past, not to victims, not even to his colleagues. But tonight, he broke his own rule. I had a little sister. His voice was quiet. She was a lot like Amelia. Brave, strong, too young to understand how unfair the world could be. Linda's eyes softened. What happened? Daniel exhaled. Our father happened. The words felt heavy, even after all these years. My mom tried to leave. She tried to protect us. But back then, no one listened. No one believed her. And one night, it cost her everything. Linda's lips parted slightly. She understood without him saying it. Daniel shook his head, running a hand down his face. I promised myself after that, if I ever got into this line of work, I'd make sure people like you and Amelia got the help my family never did. The room was silent. Then, Amelia, who had barely moved this entire time, shifted. She turned to face him, her eyes unreadable. And then, in the smallest voice, she said, Did you ever find your sister? Daniel's breath caught. Slowly, he nodded. Yeah, but she wasn't the same after. Amelia bit her lip. Will I be the same after? Daniel's heart clenched. He didn't lie to her. No, but you'll be stronger. And you'll have a life that's yours, not his. A pause. Then, for the first time since she had arrived at the station, Amelia reached forward and took Daniel's hand. It was small, cold, but so strong. Daniel squeezed it gently. And in that moment, he knew Amelia would be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. Because this time, she had a fighting chance. And for Daniel, that was enough. The strength to begin again. A temporary haven. The night air outside the police station was cold and damp, the mist rolling in from the Thames clinging to the streets like an unwanted memory. PC Daniel Carter stepped outside, inhaling deeply, his breath visible in the frigid air. His mind was still inside, still with Amelia and Linda as they prepared to leave the station for a safe house. It was a temporary solution, a band-aid on a deep wound. But at least it was a step forward. Linda and Amelia were alive, and that mattered more than anything else. The automatic doors behind him slid open, and footsteps approached. Carter. He turned to see Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins, her sharp eyes scanning him as she took a sip from a disposable coffee cup. You look like hell, she muttered. Daniel gave a tired chuckle. You're one to talk. Sarah smirked but didn't argue. They had both been running on fumes for hours, and it showed. She sighed, glancing toward the police vehicle waiting to transport Linda and Amelia. They're going to need a lot of help, you know. Daniel nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, but they've already made it this far. I think they'll be okay. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then, with a softer tone, she said, You got too close again, Carter. Daniel didn't answer. Because he knew she was right. The ride to somewhere safe, Inside the police vehicle, Linda stared out the window, her arms wrapped around Amelia, who had finally dozed off against her shoulder. The weight of the day pressed down on her. She was exhausted, but her mind wouldn't stop. The safe house was temporary, a place for domestic violence survivors to stay until long-term arrangements could be made. But what then? Where would she go? How would she build a new life from nothing? She had no family in London, no savings. Gareth controlled everything. Their bank accounts, their home, their entire lives. But not anymore. She looked down at Amelia, who stirred slightly in her sleep. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. She had to survive. For her daughter. The shadows of the past. When they arrived at the safe house, a kind-faced woman named Claire, the social worker, greeted them at the entrance. The building was small but clean, hidden on a quiet street where no one would think to look. Claire led them inside, showing them a modest but warm room. 2 beds, a wardrobe, and a small table. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Linda sat on the edge of the bed, her body aching. Amelia looked around the room but didn't say much. Linda turned to Claire. "How long do we stay here?" Claire offered a gentle smile. "As long as you need. We'll help you with everything. Housing, legal support, even job placement. You're not alone in this." Linda's throat tightened. She had been alone for so long. Now suddenly, there were people willing to help. People who actually cared. Claire crouched down to Amelia's level. "Would you like something to eat, sweetheart? We have warm soup and some bread." Amelia hesitated. Then, for the first time that night, she nodded. Claire smiled and stepped out of the room. Linda exhaled, rubbing her hands together. Then, a small voice. "Do we have to go back?" Linda turned to Amelia. Her daughter wasn't looking at her, just staring at the floor, her hands clenched into fists. Linda swallowed hard. "No, baby, we're not going back." Amelia's eyes flickered upward. Searching. Testing. "Promise," she whispered. Linda felt her heart break. She reached over and cupped Amelia's small face in her hands. "I promise." Amelia stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, she threw herself into her mother's arms. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Linda let herself cry. Gareth's last words. The next morning, PC Daniel Carter was back at the station, finishing his report on Gareth Wilkins. The man had been officially charged. It was a strong case, multiple eyewitness testimonies, police records, and Linda's bruises as evidence. But Daniel wasn't naive. Men like Gareth always fought back. They hired lawyers. They made excuses. They found loopholes in the system. But not this time. Daniel wouldn't let that happen. As he finished typing, a fellow officer tapped on his shoulder. "Carter, he's asking for you." Daniel frowned. "Who?" "Wilkins." For a moment, Daniel considered saying no, but something in his gut told him to go. Minutes later, he stood in the holding cell area, staring at Gareth Wilkins through the steel bars. The man wasn't smiling anymore. His face was swollen from the fight, his expensive clothes wrinkled. But his eyes, those cold, arrogant eyes, were still the same. "Carter." Gareth's voice was hoarse. Daniel folded his arms. "What do you want?" Gareth leaned forward slightly. "You think you've won. You think this changes anything." Daniel didn't respond. Gareth smirked. "They always come back. Women like her, they can't make it on their own. She'll realize that soon enough." Something inside Daniel snapped. He stepped forward, gripping the bars between them. "You think she's weak." His voice was low, dangerous. Gareth's smirk wavered slightly. Daniel leaned in closer. "She's stronger than you'll ever be. And Amelia, that little girl is the bravest person I've ever met." Gareth's jaw tightened. Daniel smiled, cold and sharp. "And you'll rot in here alone, because you're nothing without people to control." Gareth's hands clenched into fists. But Daniel didn't care anymore. He had seen real power last night. Not the kind that came from fear and control, but the kind that came from a mother and daughter choosing to survive. "Goodbye, Wilkins," Daniel said, turning to leave. And this time, he meant it. The first day of freedom. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by the safe house. Linda and Amelia were outside in the small courtyard, the sun shining down for the first time in days. Linda sat on a bench, looking more at peace than he had ever seen her. Amelia stood nearby, drawing with a piece of chalk on the pavement. When she saw him, she paused. For a moment, she just stared. Then, slowly, she smiled. And for Daniel Carter, that smile was worth everything. Because Amelia wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was free. A future worth fighting for. The days after freedom. It had been 3 weeks since that fateful morning. 3 weeks since PC Daniel Carter had found a frightened little girl in a phone booth, clutching a receiver with a desperation no child should ever feel. 3 weeks since Gareth Wilkins was arrested. 3 weeks since Linda and Amelia had walked out of that house for the last time. And yet, for Linda and Amelia, freedom still felt unfamiliar. The safe house had become a temporary home, a place where bruises had begun to heal, but nightmares still lingered. Amelia no longer woke up screaming every night. But some nights she still flinched in her sleep. Linda no longer jumped at every knock on the door. But sometimes, when the wind howled against the window, she'd grip Amelia's hand just a little tighter. Some wounds took longer to heal. A visit from the past. On a quiet afternoon, Linda sat at the small wooden table inside their safe house, flipping through a legal document. Her divorce papers. It was the final step. The last tie to the man who had kept her in chains. A knock at the door made her jump. But then she heard a familiar voice. "It's me, Carter." Linda exhaled, standing up to open the door. PC Daniel Carter stood there, dressed casually. No uniform today, just a black jacket and jeans. He looked different this way, less like a police officer, more like a friend. In his hands, he held a small brown envelope. Linda arched a brow. "What's this?" Daniel smiled. "Your new start." Linda's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope and opened it. Inside, she found official paperwork, a housing application, a new ID request, and even job opportunities. "I told you we'd help you get on your feet, didn't I?" Daniel said, stepping inside. Linda covered her mouth with her hand. Tears burned at her eyes. But for once, they weren't from sadness. She had spent so long feeling trapped, feeling powerless. Now, for the first time in years, she had a choice. A chance. A life that belonged to her and Amelia alone. A different kind of lesson. While Linda went over the documents, Amelia sat outside on the small patio, chalk in hand. She was drawing again. Ever since they had arrived at the safe house, she had taken to sketching in the courtyard. Her own little world, safe from everything. Daniel walked over, crouching beside her. "What are you making today?" Amelia didn't look up. "A castle." Daniel smiled. "Nice. Who lives there?" This time, Amelia glanced at him. "Me and Mommy." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Before he could say anything, Amelia looked at him more seriously. "Do you believe in monsters?" Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" Amelia continued drawing. "In books, the monsters always come back, even when the hero beats them." Daniel exhaled slowly. She was right. The fight wasn't over. Not really. Gareth would stay in jail for now, but court cases were unpredictable. And even if they never saw him again, the scars he left behind would take time to fade. Daniel picked up a piece of chalk and started drawing beside her. "You're right. Some monsters do come back." Amelia frowned. "Then how do we stop them?" Daniel tapped her drawing. "We build stronger castles." She stared at him. He smiled. "You and your mom, you're building a new life now, stronger than before. And even if a monster tries to come back, they won't win. Because this time, you're ready. Amelia studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. And when she went back to drawing, her hands weren't shaking anymore. The courtroom battle. 2 weeks later, Gareth Wilkins was taken to trial. Daniel had seen his type before. Rich, privileged men who thought they could manipulate the system, talk their way out of consequences. But this time, Gareth had underestimated something. Or rather, someone. Amelia. Linda had been reluctant at first to let Amelia testify. She didn't want her daughter to relive the trauma. But Amelia had insisted. I want to tell them what he did. I don't want him to lie. And so, the court listened. They listened as an 8-year-old girl stood in front of a room full of strangers and told them how she had hidden in a phone booth, terrified, because she thought her mother was going to die. They listened as she spoke without tears, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of a survivor. And for the first time, Gareth Wilkins looked afraid. The judge ruled in Linda and Amelia's favor. Gareth was sentenced to prison for 5 years for domestic assault and child endangerment, with a lifelong restraining order. Linda and Amelia were finally free. And this time, it was official. The last goodbye. A week later, Daniel met them one final time before they moved into their new home. It was a small flat in the city, but it was theirs. Linda had a new job at a clinic. Amelia was set to start school again in the fall. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was enough. As Daniel walked them to their new front door, Linda turned to him. You changed everything for us, Carter. Daniel shook his head. No, you did that yourselves. Linda smiled. Maybe, but you made sure we had a chance. That's more than most people ever do. Daniel nodded. If you ever need anything. Linda smirked. I know. We'll be okay, Officer Carter. Then, Amelia stepped forward. She was holding something behind her back. Daniel arched a brow. What's that? Amelia hesitated, then handed it to him. It was a drawing. A chalk castle, standing tall against the sky. In the middle stood a little girl and her mother. And just outside the castle gates, holding a sword, was a man in a police uniform. Daniel stared at it, his throat tightening. Amelia smiled. For you. Daniel took the picture, swallowing the lump in his throat. Thank you, Amelia. She grinned. You helped us build our castle. Linda laughed. Come on, Amelia. Let's start unpacking. Daniel watched them walk inside, their laughter echoing down the quiet street. Then, with one last look at the drawing in his hands, he turned and walked away. Because some stories don't need a hero. Just someone who refuses to walk away when it matters most.